everyone, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
And I'm Dr. Donnelly.
And we are here with our continuing coverage of Hulu's show, Mrs. America, covering the battle for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s. We are up to episode 5, which is entitled Phyllis and Fred and Brenda and Marc.
It's like one of those t-shirts.
Yes, one of those t-shirts. I think it was Hamilton ones, but yes, where it's got all the first names on it.
Yeah.
This one's kind of a lot of first names as opposed to just one. And it is basically a tale of two marriages or two relationships and the interworkings and other people that intersect with that as well. We get to see our dear beloved Adam Brody return to the TV, which is very, very exciting. I love him. And so we're into 1974. We get a little bit of Gloria in this episode. She's meeting with a DOJ appointee who wants to start a women's commission. They flirt a little bit back and forth about both being from Illinois and then later hook up in the episode. We get to see our girl RBG show up with Brenda and Gloria. And then we get this idea that there should be a second debate, another debate with Phyllis Schlafly. She's gaining a lot of attention, more attention than her husband, which creates some tension for them. And the women's movement decides to have Brenda do it because she is the constitutional lawyer. And so she can make a lot of the legal arguments against or combat a lot of the arguments that Phyllis is making. So another thing that's really interesting in this episode is this exploration of sexuality at a time when it appears that we only have real understandings of like being straight or gay or lesbian, certainly within the women's movement. And we've already seen in this season not a lot of room for lesbianism in the women's movement, and some negative perceptions and stereotypes, and Betty, our dear Betty, doesn't really like the gays very much, but through Brenda we get to see this exploration of her own sexuality. She meets Jules, who's a photographer who's worked with Gloria in the past, and they start an affair as she kind of figures out what's going on with her body and who she's attracted to and who she likes to spend time with and have sex with. And it doesn't appear that she understands that she can like love and be attracted to her husband and want to have sex with women at the same time. But her husband very beautifully has this conversation with her after the debate, and says, we can make our family whatever we want it to be. Why can't you be just who you are? And so there was one of the things Dr. Kristen and I talked about offline was it was a really empathetic way to explore kind of figuring out who you are.
Yeah.
Before culturally we really had a word like bisexuality or, any of the other words we've adopted in the last 5 or 10 years to describe who you like to spend time with. And form relationships with. So that was really, really well done. We get the most of the episode is Phyllis and Marc and Brenda and Fred having a debate on television. Which goes terribly well for the Schlaflys, and raise your hand if you felt good about it.
Yeah, after every time I watch the episode, I always watch it after Dr. Erin does just because of our particular schedules. I always slack her and say, spoiler alert, still hate Phyllis.
Still hate Phyllis.
Still hate Phyllis.
Yeah, I don't think any of us needed to know that she calls Fred daddy.
No, I mean, all God's children, your kink is not my kink and that's okay. But, things I didn't need to hear out loud.
Yeah, all of those things. But it could have stayed in your bedroom.
It really could have stayed in the director's cut.
Yeah. So, like, if I ever meet anyone who works on this show, I'll be like, thank you so much. It was amazing. Also, never do that again.
Never do that again. That one word.
I'd like to talk to you. Thank you so much for your contribution to television about women's issues. but I'd like to talk to you about one line from Phyllis and Fred and Brenda and Marc. Please don't ever do that.
It just didn't, it just wasn't, I don't actually think it necessarily added anything to the character either, because like to be the gender scholar for a little bit, like daddy kink is a very specific thing. Like people who call their sexual partners daddy, there isn't or mommy, that like that's a very specific thing. To have it as a throwaway line, and to not unpack what that meant, because what I felt is that then they're implying that she's almost a child with him, not by consent, or like all those kind of other things. Like daddy kink is a very, all kink should be mutually consensual. But it's a very specific one.
Yeah.
Just throw away with one line and Cate Blanchett making a very strange face.
Yes. No, and that's a really good point to make. And I think they wanted to tie it into the line that comes up in the debate later on when Fred.
Yeah, the submissive line.
Submissive line. But then again, there's a difference between like, and you know a lot more about kink than I do, but like submissive.
Like, yeah, parental, like infantilization and dominant and submissive are not the same kink.
Are not the same thing either.
No.
And yeah, it seemed kind of irresponsible to just throw those words around. And like clearly Fred was responding to, you know, Phyllis tanking the debate by claiming.
You can't just make up a court case.
Just make up a court case. Oh, it was so painful.
She started sitting there. I was like, oh, child, we're not in your like ERA rallies where everybody is going to believe you. Like,
yeah, you have to be accountable for your words.
Yeah.
And, you know, we also get some further insights into Phyllis's need to prove. I don't know why she wants to go to law school. I don't know why she has decided to take the LSATs for her son. That was also a strange thing. That she could prove her intellect in some way.
I think there's a lot tied up in the like what her other son says right before their very heavy-weighted conversation about his homosexuality without actually having a conversation about his homosexuality, when she says it's the only thing left that's dad's.
Yeah.
And I think like we've talked about this before. She's not a housewife. Like the way Brenda dresses her down is completely correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
She may have birthed her children. I'm not convinced she raised them
at all,
or had a primary caring responsibility. She has outsourced that to potentially various nannies and maids over the years, as well as her sister-in-law.
Yeah.
And so it would make sense to me that she is still craving a place in this world in a way, because she's not actually welcome in any of the spaces she claims to inhabit.
Right.
The problem is she's not actually welcome in any of the spaces that she claims to inhabit. Like,
yeah. And I empathize with that, because I think, you know, I think it must have been really hard at times to be a really smart woman.
Can't imagine. Yep.
And she's clearly exceptionally bright, understands logic and arguments well enough to like bullshit the LSATs. And, you know, we've always talked about offline, like how we wouldn't want to be in other historical periods and be like as smart and ambitious and as driven as we are for, you know.
Not into fantastical time traveling. Like
the careers that we have chosen. We have faced a lot of sexism and discrimination even now. I can't imagine trying to choose that career in the 1950s.
Nope.
So I have a level of empathy for how she struggles to navigate this, but also she does it in a destructive way. And yeah, you know, if she wanted to become a lawyer because she loved the law, you know, go with God. It makes you happy, go with God. She's trying to like prove something.
And you're just never that's one of those things where like if you're nothing without with the gold medal, you're nothing without like.
Yeah. Like why do you need this? If she wanted to become a lawyer so that she could make more arguments against people like Brenda and Marc for the advocacy of her position,
which is fine, but we know she doesn't really care about the ERA either. Yeah. And so like, it's just, she continues to be a really complicated and fascinating figure, but
yes,
she was, to me, this was the most privilege she exercised throughout like, we joked offline that she's the original Karen asking to see a manager, but like, who just walks up to the LSATs and says, actually, I'm doing it instead of this man. And like,
yeah. And the arrogance that she sat down in front of Brenda and Marc as well, on live television and hadn't prepared her arguments, just because, you know, she thought she had this superiority that her marriage was better than their marriage. And so that was gonna like help her win the debate. And I'm like, yep. They both went to like,
they're both in Harvard.
They're both Harvard law graduates. Like,
yeah, and like contrary to Elle Woods' opinion, like, yes, it is hard to get in there. Like,
yeah, it's difficult.
It's difficult.
Yeah, and Brenda has also argued cases before the Supreme Court. So like, to use a popular Northern Irishism, like
wind your neck in there, Phyllis.
Wind your neck in, Phyllis. So it becomes this kind of comparison between the two viewpoints of marriage or relationships in that way. I love that Marc steps up in the debate, doesn't need to very much, but steps up and says, our marriage is forged in the crucible of feminism, which, like, find you a man that says that.
Mm-hmm. I know, like, I mean, when I look at those two marriages, the one I have is a lot more like Brenda and Marc's.
He's a lot more like Brenda and Marc.
We were forged in the crucible of feminism. We were forged in the crucible of Belfast.
Yeah.
It's certainly, like, the question I loathe, one of the questions I loathe about my marriage the most that I still get is who wears the pants in my marriage.
It's awful.
When people hear my position in our company and my title, oh, how does your husband feel about that?
How does your husband feel about that is one that you get a lot, I know.
I get so often.
Like, do you ever ask him how he feels about, how do you feel, how does your wife feel about you working full time?
Mm-hmm. No. Yeah, same way that, like, I get all the kid questions and he never does. Like, it's all of that. But, like, we're still asking women. We're still asking, and I love it when we ask my lesbian friends, who wears the pants in your relationship?
Yeah.
Why are we still doing a gender? But anyway,
why are we genderizing something that doesn't need to be? The episode ends with an interesting conversation between Phyllis and her son. Throughout the episode, we learn that he apparently had been to some, gay bar or gay establishment and left his wallet, and an enterprising young man brought it to the house and indicated that he knew who Phyllis was, and so she had to, like, pay him to
keep quiet.
And so she has to confront her son about this, but she doesn't really, and they don't really have a conversation, and she makes some terrible analogy about quitting smoking. It's a sharp contrast to the conversation that Marc and Brenda have, right, about sexuality and being who you are. So,
all I could think about, one of the times I watched, I can't even remember what the show was, but it was an example of a conversation like this, where somebody tries to come out to their parent, and this is how the parent responds. And I was watching it with a friend who is gay, and he just looked at me, he goes, "That's why gay kids commit suicide."
Yeah.
Like, and I don't want to put that on the Schlafly son or anything else, but that went through my head as I watched that scene. This level of, this way that parents sometimes understand but don't understand is one of the contributing factors to the incredibly high rate of suicide we have among LGBT teens.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. And it's difficult to watch because it's clear that she loves her son very much.
Oh my God, so much she would bleed for him. Yep.
And we've seen this a lot with parents who don't, I don't think she, agrees with his sexuality or thinks that it's okay. I'm not saying
she would certainly use the word lifestyle. Yep.
Yes, she did. But I also think there's an element to parents that, like, don't want to see their children suffer.
Yeah.
And so that happens a lot in coming out stories, I know, is that it's like, why do you want this lifestyle? It's going to be really hard for you. Like, you're never going to fit in, all of these kinds of...
Yeah, like, don't you know what you're giving up? Like, yeah.
like that come from a position of love but are still really, really damaging.
Really toxic. Yep.
And so I think we get that from her. So it's hard because you're like, oh, you love your son, but like she also, I'm sure, thinks that it's a sin and thinks that it's a lifestyle choice and not who he is and how he was born, which is what a lot of people think about sexuality as well. So she's not alone. But yeah, it was a difficult one to watch, and I don't know what's going to happen to her son the rest of the show or in life. I might look up and find out what happened, but
I register my nervousness.
Yeah. So we don't know where we're going from here.
Except that we're going to go to Elizabeth Banks's character.
Except that we get a Republican perspective on a person fighting for the ERA as they struggle. I think there's still 4 states left that need to ratify in this episode, but we'll continue to see what happens throughout the 70s and the journey towards ratification. And we will see you all for episode 6.
Bye.